to switch them off. Okay? Thank you. Right. I think before we start, I'd like everybody to introduce themselves, please. And this is also for the purpose of live streaming, of course. I'll start with myself. I'm Penny Jones, and I'm chairman of CYP.
Peter Farley, vice chair of this committee.
Hazel Eilert, scrutiny manager.
Jeff Burrows, County Councillor and Cabinet Member for Social Services.
Simon Birch, Chief Officer.
Non Jenkins from the Wales Audit Office.
Simon Howarth, Councillor for Gilwell and Ettley Linklater.
Debbie Blakeborough, Councillor for the Trellick United area.
Maureen Powell, County Councillor for the Castle Ward and Abergavenny.
Linda Guppy, County Councillor for Rogate and a member of this committee.
Jane Rogers, Safeguarding Service Manager.
Tracy Giles, Head of Children's Services.
Jill Cox, Service Manager in Children's Services.
Val Smith, Member, just observing.
We have County Councillors Harris, Webb, Clark, and Mr Plough and Reverend James. Thank you.
Before I start introducing the speakers' presentations, I'm going to ask Simon Birch, who's Chief Officer, Social Care and Health, to give us some background information on the similarities and timing of the reports that we're about to have this afternoon. Simon, if you'd like a brief explanation, please.
Thank you, Chair. I will keep it brief. That's probably a theme for the afternoon, isn't it? Brevity. First of all, thank you very much to the members for fitting in this special meeting, because the original intention of this was particularly around the safeguarding reporting arrangements, which is a crucial part of our response to Estin and indeed our sort of improvement journey generally. And we had to fit it in so that we could get the information coming through for the first 2 quarters and then get it ready to come here and to Cabinet and then move on from there. So thank you for attending. And I realise we've got quality rather than quantity today, but thank you very much. We can have a very good discussion around that. But once we made that decision, it became clear that once you're talking about the breadth of safeguarding, you're bringing really most of the work of the Children's Services Department into play. So we thought it was a great chance to bring along some very important reports we've received in the last few months. The Looked After Children Inspection, which we're going to hear from Pam Clutton about later on, has some important messages for us, and indeed messages we're already working on. So we thought that was urgent. The Wales Audit Office has carried out a useful piece of work that really sat alongside what Estin had been talking to us about, and so we've got none here to do that. And then we thought if we wrap up what's other work, including the fostering work, it brings the whole picture together really about how we support children and young people. So thank you for what is obviously a heavy agenda, but I think what you find as we go through it is that the same issues will be coming up, and actually rather than duplicating, they'll be reinforcing the key issues for this service.
Thanks. Thank you, Simon. Right. Well, safeguarding of children is everybody's responsibility, and it's something we must be aware of, and I think we will be aware of by the end of this meeting. In May 2014, the Wales Audit Office completed a review of MCC's local authority arrangements to support safeguarding of children. And Non Jenkins from the Wales Audit Office is now going to take us through this review and answer questions during or afterwards. Non, which would you prefer, if there are any? Afterwards, I think so. And we find we may find that the next report addresses some of the issues anyway. All right. Thank you, Non.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'll quickly go through it. I'm assuming everybody will have read the report anyway. The presentation that we've put together, although I wasn't the person that undertook the work, the presentation that we pulled together is also based on some of the work that we've done across Wales, because as you know, this is going to be summarised in a national report in the new year. So hopefully we can bring that information into this presentation. So in going through it, obviously the Chair clearly said at the beginning, each person and body has responsibility for safeguarding, and there are functions that councils are responsible for, as per the slide there. I'm not going to go through them, but it's clearly set out what responsibilities and what roles councils have in safeguarding children and in promoting the welfare of children. The scope of the study that we undertook, and you will have had your local report back, was an examination of what local authorities, not just councils, so local authorities across Wales, do to seek assurance that their arrangements to support safeguarding are effective. So that we weren't looking at safeguarding practice, it's the arrangements we were looking at. And particularly, really looking at the corporate responsibility that organisations have for safeguarding children. How does the council assure itself that it knows that it's got the arrangements in place to safeguard children, rather than looking at how you do it? It's what arrangements do you have in place, and how do you respond to that corporate responsibility in order that you know that you're safeguarding children. And the key questions of the study were around as follows: do councils' governance and management arrangements provide assurance that children are safeguarded? Are there clear governance and accountability and management arrangements? So that's more around the arrangements. The second part is, do you have monitoring arrangements in place? And do you have evidence that that basically you're acting on that monitoring information? Have you got those systems in place to make sure that if you arrive at a situation where those arrangements are showing, or monitoring is showing that there's an issue, how do you act on that? So that's the third part of our work. And then the methods, as you always know how we do our audits, usually nothing different in the way that we've done this one to previous audits. Desktop review of policies and documents that we will have asked all authorities, interviews, the survey also of members and officers, of which you will have had in your packs, and the report, the findings of those. And also whistleblowing arrangements. So we did a separate whistleblowing review, which we will have reported separately to you, but we've summarised it also here in this report. So whilst we didn't come to an overall conclusion in the report, the key message, I think, would be the most appropriate word to use. Key messages, the message from the report is that there are some weaknesses in the council's arrangements to support safeguarding of children that need to be addressed. And I think the issues here are, a lot of it is also built into your arrangements for responding to the Eston issues, as well as wider issues. Obviously Margaret and Pam are coming later to put forward the CSIW views also. So a lot of this is also ongoing, and much of this also that you will be aware of. There are also other things that you might need to take away from this in order to further improve. So I'll just quickly go through some of those. In terms of policies and procedures, progress has been made on improving policies and procedures following the inspection findings that I just talked about. And in terms of safeguarding and child protection policies, I think the key message there is that quite a lot more has been done in education than most of the other departments, and I think it's that consistency and corporateness about it that needs to be built on more. Whistleblowing policies are concise, but in some places contradictory, not clear where to go and who to speak to at some point, and would benefit obviously from review and better greater clarity on that. And the allegations policy, you're using, well, you were at the time using the regional South East Wales policy, and you didn't have your own, and you needed to have your own. So hopefully you've put that in place at this point in time. But the key point here is that staff awareness of policies and procedures needs to be regularly checked and tailored locally. And that's a message for you, but also it's a common message across Wales. So it's not something just here for Monmouthshire. So that's just in doing all of this across the 22, we were able to bring that as a common theme out, and I'm sure that will be reflected in the national summary. In terms of recruitment and training, some good areas here, I'd say, in terms of appropriate systems in place for safe recruitment of staff and volunteers. Further development of the disclosure and barring service protocol is in progress, and safeguarding training being rolled out across the council. Obviously, at the time there wasn't much training for members. Hopefully, that's now been put in place. But in terms of that's a key point in terms of training members for safeguarding. And whistleblowing training needs to be made available to all staff. It's there for some staff, but not all. So that's an area for development, but it is in progress. So there's a couple of things to improve on there, particularly in terms of the training for members. But across Wales, the main issues on training are that generally training isn't targeted and tailored to people's differing roles. So what a cabinet member or a scrutiny chair or a chief executive or a head of service, the roles differ, so their training needs and requirements for safeguarding children will differ. So it's generally training quite generic rather than tailored to the differing roles and responsibilities for officers and members. And also, it's not recruitment and training. It's not seen, the training. Safeguarding is not usually seen as a priority as part of induction training. So when you get new people or new members in, it's not really on the radar in terms of training. But that's a general issue across Wales. These are just me bringing things out for you in terms of what we found across Wales. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, a very good move forward in terms of establishing a safeguarding and quality assurance unit. Would say a good practice step forward, I would think, in that. Obviously, it was new at the time and is yet to be embedded. We'll look forward to hearing how that develops in time. But what it set out to do and what it reads that it should be doing sounds good. So let's see how you get on with that. And you also have internal audit that undertake audits in terms of safeguarding and DPS. Or disclosure and barring issues and procedures. And I suppose the key issue there for you as scrutiny would be how you might play a part in that, given that there's an internal audit play a sort of internal check, that you have this safeguarding quality assurance unit. How do you and them all work together to make sure that the checks and balances for safeguarding is working? So posing a question. And then another point in terms of monitoring and evaluation is in relation to the quality and coverage of performance information. Again, not just about education, not just about quantifiable, it's about the qualitative information too. And I know you were working on that at the time. So we left you with some proposals for improvement around reviewing the safeguarding and child protection policy to ensure that it covers all the council areas. So it's this corporateness and consistency across your departments and services. Ensure the development of safeguarding and quality assurance unit enables, basically embed it in the way that you planned it to happen. And then improve the range and quality and coverage of safeguarding performance reporting to provide adequate assurance that systems are working effectively. I won't go through the details of the survey respondents, but as you can see, Monmouthshire, a total of 88 members and officers collectively responded to the survey, which is fairly good in terms of comparison with the rest of Wales. I had to ask whether Wales 1996 was actually the year or whether it was the total that actually responded to the survey, but it actually is the total that responded to the survey. And those are the kind of people that responded to the survey, and that's who we responded. And in going through the survey findings at the back of the report, this doesn't make it any different. So what you'll see is that Monmouthshire are around about the Wales average or better in the main. The key area, I think, and across Wales this is that, can you I can't even point. The middle one, when you, in terms of training for the safeguarding, protecting children and young people, in Wales, 10% never received training. That's 1 in 10 people never received. So you're slightly higher than that, but 1 in 10 is still quite a big thing that we will be bringing out in the national survey. Summary report is, well, that's quite a lot. So leave you with that. But that's the kind of key point. But you're there or thereabouts the Wales average or better. But that's not to say that you're perfect, and that's not. So everybody's got. Wait, is that okay? Yes. Yes? Great. Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Non. That was very interesting. I think I have got a couple of questions arising from that, but I think I'll ask you later on when you've heard of our progress reports as well, and then you can see if there's been a comparison. Has anyone any questions as a result of that preview? Councillor Powell.
Yeah, just a very simple one. You just said then that there was someone had no training at all. Do you mean just in the safeguarding of children, or none at all completely? In safeguarding, thank you. That's just wanted to get that clear. Thank you very much.
Councillor Blakeborough.
You started to sort of answer this question, and I find it interesting trying to compare us to the rest of Wales. And I always get worried if we are sticking to the Welsh average, because we shouldn't be really. And as was its sort of generic question, it is how do we compare with the rest of Wales? How do we stand out from the crowd, whether on a negative or a positive? Hopefully there's some positive. I think there is some positive there, definitely positive. And what is it that we're doing differently from the rest of Wales?
Without going into league tables and things like that, I understand authorities don't like league tables, but then we always get the question, how do we compare to the rest of Wales? You can't have, so I think in going through the report, we've tried to pull out some of the key points, and particularly some that the unit that you've set up it is an outlier. It is something that you stand up from the crowd on in having that unit. It's now about how do you embed it. It's a good thing that you've established it well, but it's only as good as it is in practice, really. So I'm sure we'll hear from Simon in terms of how it's embedding and progressing in terms of that. And yeah, that's the key point, I would say, in terms of outliers here. Some of the recruitment and training elements that I brought out are good, but again, some elements in terms of members need to be bolstered up. But in terms of comparing across Wales, I think the key point there is to wait until the national summary, because then we can bring out some of the quantitative stuff that you might want to hear about. The qualitative stuff we can reflect, and we have reflected in the report, but the quantitative stuff we can reflect more about in that national survey. So sorry if I can't answer more than that. Obviously you have known that you've had to do and had to make a big step on this. And there is evidence that you are making progress on some areas, and the unit in itself should help if it is working in the way that you intended it to. So, yeah.
Anybody else want to make a comment on that? No?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Councillor Farley.
Thank you, Non. I'm interested in there's a line in your slide that says something like, there's more done in education than elsewhere. That's, in one way, not surprising, but in another, there's a clear implication that more could be done elsewhere. So there's two questions here, really. What kind of things are others doing elsewhere than in education that we could perhaps emulate?
I'm not the person to ask for that question, but I can get back to you.
But the essence is that there is more that needs to be done in other areas than education. That's crucial. So we're talking beyond education. We may well be talking beyond children's services. It's right across a council's activities.
yes, that I can answer, and that comes out clearly in the work that's been undertaken. It isn't just about education, it isn't just about children, it's about, because all of your work, and I think we touch on in terms of equality assessments, it builds into that. Well, you know, all decisions potentially have an impact on vulnerable people, whether that's children or adults, and poverty the same. So it's about how do you take into consideration in making decisions on how it impacts across the council on children in safeguarding.
Thank you. Thank you, Non, for that. It was very interesting. I think we'll go on to the next report now, which may address some of the issues that have just come up. And Jane Rogers, the Safeguarding Quality Assurance Manager, is going to make this report. Jane, would you like to come down here, please? Thank you. And just to give some background, in 2012, November, Estin carried out an inspection. This was monitored in February 2014, and it was echoed by the Welsh Audit Office in March 2014. So the issues that arose then are now going to be addressed by Jane. Okay, Jane? No? Whilst we're waiting, I just want to say that I'm sitting at the side here alongside my vice chair and the scrutiny manager because there's been a fault with cameras and we've had to use the central point rather than side points. Yes, Simon?
Chair, may I just ask, I thought Non was going to sit in...
Yes, she's at the back at the moment.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I thought she'd gone.
Yes, yes, and me. Okay. All right, Jane? Thank you.
Yes,
Simon, you're going to introduce... Okay.
Well, only to give Jane a chance just to sort of gather her breath, really. Yeah, I mean, that was a really useful introduction to what we're about to talk about, because the issue about is safeguarding an issue across the whole authority, are we beginning to evidence for members and others how we're doing and so on, it's exactly what Jane has been focusing on. And as she explains about the reports and how they're coming forward, that's exactly at the heart of what we're trying to achieve, and we hope that by the end of this process, of which this is the first real go at it, you as members you'll have a real sense of how children and young people are being safeguarded in Monmouthshire, not just in education, not just in social services, but more broadly. So over to Jane for a sort of 5-minute intro, and then we'll open it up for you to comment on the reports.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to the 3 reports that you will have already received. And the first thing that I'd like to say is something about why there are 3 reports and what the different reports, what role they play within the overall kind of reporting structure. Like Simon said, this is the first time that we've really brought these 3 reports together in this format. The first report, which is the strategic overview, really tries to kind of give a much more narrative feel of some of the key areas that we work on in safeguarding and how we evaluate that and how we use that as a kind of guide for how we move forward within our key areas. The second report is the report card, and that tries to show some of the evidence base from which we're making our evaluative statement. So it tries to provide the underpinning to the strategic report in a way that shows kind of performance information, report card style information. And the third report is the service improvement plan, which really tries to show how we follow through some of that information and some of those evaluative statements at an operational level. So the reports hang together and should, in a way, complement each other and show the breadth of what we are trying to do within the Safeguarding Quality Assurance Unit and beyond. Simon suggested that maybe just the best way of coming at some of this was clearly not to go into the detail of the reports because you've had a chance to read them, but just to kind of give you some headlines from the strategic report and some sense of the progress that we've made from the first time that we looked at trying to report in this way. And on there's a summary table within the report that just outlines in a box format where our key areas are: policy, training.
Sorry, Jane,
audit.
can you
Into
name
the
the
mic.
page? Would that be possible?
Have you got a page number? Yeah.
27.
Okay, page 27, everybody. Thank you.
Apologies. So it just sets out our key areas of activity, and it shows where we were 6 months ago and where we believe that we are now in terms of our self-evaluation. Our scores, you'll see, range from the kind of 3 to the 5. Most scores have stayed the same, and there's 3 scores where we feel that because of our activity we've made some progress. Those are in our audit work, our safe recruitment work, and in our work around professional allegations. The other aspect of the report is the case studies. I'd like just to kind of say why we include them. We did it the first time that we reported in this way through the strategic report, and it's really a way of trying to kind of show how aspects of safeguarding really sometimes don't work alone, but they really interact and they build over time if you've got some really good solid foundations around safeguarding. And the case studies try to show you how they come together in a real way to impact and influence the lives of our most vulnerable children in Monmouthshire. That's it.
Okay. I think we'll take questions and
That was very interesting, Jane. Thank you. It's a comprehensive report. Well, 3 reports in one, isn't it? And with an action plan. And to me, it shows that there is progression. However, I'm sure there are questions that members would like to ask. Councillor Bakeborough.
Going to your grid there. Sorry, just going back. I'm not very good on this technical bit. Right, okay. So yeah, point 7 about being well informed. I'm assuming that's around training, and we've not moved from the report from. I'm just thinking there's no change. So the audit report that we've just heard was saying that the areas we need to look at is raising awareness and training and level 1, level 3, and making it specialised and all that kind of thing right across the whole authority. And I'm just looking at this point 7. We were 3, we're still 3. So that's telling me you haven't changed, but I'm sure there has been some changes and improvements in the training. Linking into the training, again, one of the questions I'd asked ages ago was what is our target that we're looking for? How many are we looking to train at level 1 and level 2, and how many have we trained to date? Just so we can have some sort of an idea of the number progression. I've got a few other questions, but that's the first one. Just around.
The point number 7, where we stayed 3, doesn't actually refer to our training. That refers more to what we understand about the overall safeguarding needs of children in Monmouthshire, and the way that we use that to really try and ensure that good practice around safeguarding and child protection is embedded across the authority. So, for example, within the work that we've been doing, we've kind of been able to look at domestic abuse, for example, kind of identifying that as our one of our key issues that affect parenting. We've been looking at examples around neglect and how we. So it's that point 7 is more really about what we understand to be our safeguarding child protection needs across Monmouthshire, and we're looking at that by what referrals come in, what the nature of the referrals are, what happens to children, and so forth. The questions that you've raised about training are something that it is hard to answer, because when we're trying to say how many people are we targeting for level 1, our target for level 1 is as big and as wide as the workforce within Monmouthshire is, and that's not just within Monmouthshire as a council, but out in all the private, voluntary and third sector organisations as well. To try and put a figure on it is really difficult. What we've been thinking about, how we think about responding to that, is to try and look much more from a so what point of view around our level 1 training. And we've thought about some ways that we can start looking at how we do that, asking those questions across the workforce within Monmouthshire. Is, do you know the basic signs and symptoms, and do you know what you should do if you see a concern? So rather than going for that number crunching with the level 1, we're really trying to go for more the impact. So things like using the Survey Monkey and so forth is something that we've thought about in terms of implementing for level 1. Actually, following the kind of idea around that came from the Welsh Audit Office survey, going, do you know what to do if there's a child concern? So certainly in terms of trying to give you a brief answer around the level 1, I can't tell you what the whole workforce for children and families is across the whole of Monmouthshire. And what we're really trying to do is look for, are we kind of flooding our services, and I say services as wide as I possibly can mean them, in Monmouthshire, so that we assure ourselves that people know what to do.
I agree with that. It's no good just putting an hour's course on and just saying, yes, 100% has been covered without the so what. I guess with the numbers, it's how do we know who we have trained? So, for example, I don't know, highways or transport.
Yeah.
Have everybody within transport had that training? Do you know where the gaps are?
Yeah. We're starting to pin those out and trying to map our training needs across the authority. We certainly know who we have trained. We don't know who we haven't quite to the same extent, but we're feeling our way through the whole time. So, for example, whatever our information shows us, we try and target. An example of that would be around our passenger transport unit. So our safeguarding audit showed us that there was a very bespoke need for how we go on and train taxi drivers and escorts. They needed something very specific to their needs. That's now being addressed by booking that training in and getting a course that's specifically relevant for them and so forth. Similarly, in our private residential units, often if we have a professional allegation arising from those units, it can quite often show a training gap. It's a huge area in terms of trying to capture all the people who need level 1 within Monmouthshire, and we're making huge strides to do it. The added complication around it is the number of people who we now have trained in terms of being able to deliver training. They're mainly our designated officers within schools, but we haven't quite got the feedback loop in place to ensure that any training that they're now going on to do, we are getting that accurate information. So we've got a very clear sense of what our training gaps and needs are as we move forward. The task is now around completing some of them.
Thank you. Can Councillor Burrows just come in on this, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to add a point, just kind of put a little bit of colour to that, because clearly training for its own sake is just training. The most important thing that's come across for me as far as the safeguarding story is the cultural embedding of it. Is really kind of getting people to really understand why it's so important, just how diffuse it has to be throughout everything we do, whether it's highways or children's services or whatever. And only when you start to really embed culture and people understand and get it, does then the value of training start to have some real meaning, because people then understand there's a cause and effect in this. And we're on a journey, and I'm really pleased with the numbers of people that are taking up the training, but there's a lot more to be done. But there's a lot of stuff to be done in parallel, through the leadership, through the training that we're looking to try and do, and diffusing information through the scrutiny, all the scrutiny committees, through the chairs. It's a question of getting people to really thoroughly understand why we're doing it and really why it's so significant. And only once that starts to kind of get into the psyche of the organisation, will training really can continue. It'll be a catalyst for yet more and see increased value for it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I do take your point about having a culture, but you need the training to start developing that culture, because training is not just about giving facts, but to do exactly what you're saying, really. Yeah. Yeah, and just with prioritising the groups, and we were talking about level 1 and level 2 training. Could you just give us a brief overview of which groups you would sort of target for level 1 and then level 2, and I guess there's level 3 as well?
Yep. It's probably easier if I start at the top. Yeah. So we our level 4 training actually is around the kind of leaders and governors and elected members. we've got some way to go still with that. Our level 3 courses are more like specific areas of interest for practitioners who are working with child protection and more complex safeguarding on a day-to-day basis as part of their professional development. We advise them to continue with kind of a level 3 type of programme. Our level 2 is much clearer, and our level 2, we target designated officers. So we target all those in schools, in leisure centres, our decision makers, for example, within adult services, our decision makers within passenger transport, for example, those people who are in the decision making chair when it comes to, do we make a referral? How do we manage this concern? What other agencies do we need to know about in terms of understanding our role better? So level 2 really targets that group, and it covers things around how do you make the referral, what happens then, what should you expect if you don't, it takes you much more through that kind of how do we think about and reflect on child protection issues as they arise. So it's very much targeted to those people who are decision makers. And it goes right through, the kind of legal aspect and what happens after referral, right through to kind of role-playing a child protection conference, thinking about how they might be asked to contribute in that way. And it also covers that kind of referral kind of bit around things like child sexual exploitation. So when would we refer for those kind of specific issues? It covers internet safety and so forth. Most of those we work in partnership with the board within the Regional Safeguarding Board to kind of access those courses. Our level 1, then I always think about, our level 1 is the gateway for some of the rest of it, but also our level 1 is targeted at everybody who may possibly come into contact with children and families. And our level 1 is really, our level 1s, we want to be absolutely able to identify who their level 2 designated officer is and have that very direct point of operational reporting. So our level 1 really is basic. It's your responsibility, know the signs and symptoms, know who within your specific organisation you report to. What would you do if you were on nights and you're on your own and you've got a concern? What then? It's that kind of basic level.
Thank you, Jane. Councillor Farley.
Thank you. You've already sort of taken us some way towards this, and it's all around the same page, because we're also suggesting that there's been an improvement under number 6, the professional allegations area. The bit that interests me there isn't so much our own organisation. You've touched on that, and that's a huge job. But there's also a suggestion that we've not been terribly good in the past with regard to accountability of other employers. But we are improving. And how do we engage other employers than ourselves in these issues? Is it something that you could tell us a bit about? I think do you want me to give you the reference? It's on
Page 47.
well, yeah. Anyway, and other places as well. So it's really getting the same work, the same sense of accountability with other employers than ourselves.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think our performance information from having analysed some of the professional strats that come through does show a good range of where those original allegations arise from. And I know from my own experience that we certainly get plenty from, say for example, our private residential homes. We have a good steady stream of professional allegations. And through the role of the LOC, so Heather's role, she's really been out and about in the county to engage those third sector, those private organisations that wouldn't fall within the direct auspices of the authority. And I think our figures reflect that. So they are, as care providers or as organisations, providing services for children and families, regardless of the fact that they're not in the authority, they're still under the same statutory guidance as we are ourselves under the All Wales Child Protection Procedures. They have responsibilities under that in the same way as the authority does. And if they have a child protection concern about a member of staff, they're the same duty to report to us, and we then manage that through the professional process. One of the things that's been really pleasing about, in terms of the professional allegations, is this development of the role of Heather's role, the LOSI role, at that lower level of concern, which really helps organisations then start to understand the statutory threshold and how you might manage things differently, and also how you might manage things preventatively within the organisation. We do a lot of work around that within the residential units, as there are a few of them in Monmouthshire.
Thank you. Helpful answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Powell.
Thank you for that. You explained a lot of things to me that I didn't really quite get the levels and all that. Over the years, I've done 3 lots of safeguarding children training, and the last one I did was very much different to the other 2, but it was far more enlightening, and I found it a far more benefit. What concerns me is that there are people who've gone through all the training, people who've got their, well, it's DBS now, not CRB, checks regularly, and yet they can still be a danger to the children. But it can give almost a false sense of security when you think, well, they're all right, they've done all the training, they've got all the safeguards and everything, and yet that still happens. Is there any way at all that we can be, I don't know exactly trained, but alerted to things that might make us think that something isn't quite right? Because that is where a lot of the real danger lies, when you think everything's safe and it isn't.
Well, I mean, I'll just reply generally. I mean, clearly we will never sit here and tell you that we can guarantee that all children and young people, pity we can't wave that magic wand, but we can't. So what we can do is the sort of things you've been hearing about from Jane, and it's about how we sort of cross-reference and triangulate a lot of these things. I think when Jane talked about Heather's role, the lead officer for safeguarding education, and that plays out through some of these case studies that we included, I think it starts to show you how, if you've got somebody who you can ring up and say, I'm not sure about this, but that, I've got a member of staff who's acting a bit strange, you can have a quick chat about it. That sort of relationship building, supported by other training, is a way in which the conversation takes place rather than not taking place. And we've seen that again and again. The leisure centre person who says, I'm not sure whether that guy is acting appropriately or not, but by raising the issue, it turns out to get resolved and so on. I don't know whether you wanted to add or...
Just to echo Simon, really, and safeguarding's never a done deal. It's a constant process of evaluation, questioning, reflection, and vigilance. And if we ever sit back and think, it's okay, we're all right now, we've lost it. And it's that kind of culture within our training that we really try and embed, especially for the designated officers, but also at level 1. And sometimes it's, that people at level 1 have never had to think about actually what does child protection and safeguarding mean to me, and it's starting that dialogue, it's starting those conversations. And just over the LOSI role has been in place for 2 years. Heather's been in post just over a year, or coming up a year now, and having that permanent staff member in who's really developing these dialogues over time is one of our best ways of trying to assure ourselves that we're keeping children as safe as we possibly can.
Councillor Howarth, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, may I ask, Chair?
Yes.
With all the associations we have in Monmouthshire and the outer areas of Monmouthshire, and I'll just give you an example, East Gwent junior football, and there's rugby, and there's all these associations, masses of volunteers out there who actually have safeguarding officers and welfare officers within their structures, and I'm talking not 1 per 10, perhaps 1 per 6. Are we doing any joined up thinking with them associations, bringing people together? Because i.e., if you've got a safeguarding issue within that structure, it is going to peel off. It may be within Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 within Monmouth School and may not have been picked up, or vice versa. I am a safeguarding officer with the FAW as well myself. These associations are so good to work with and feed off them as well. Actually, we could save a lot of time here and move forward with what we're wanting to do here by talking to these people and seeing what we can put in place to move it far quicker than we are. Have we had any thoughts on that at the moment?
Thank you. We certainly have been thinking about that, and it was one of our aims for the audit this year, was to really try and engage with all those third sector, all those voluntary clubs and organisations that are out there. and it's a huge task, as you can imagine, but there are also key strengths within there we can build upon. So the first thing that we've done within that is to really get some good, strong links with Garvo and with TVA in Torvine. And we've profiled with Garvo all the organisations that are associated with Garvo in Monmouthshire and kind of screen them to think which of these are our kind of red bills who we need to actually get out there, kind of do audits with and so forth, and identify key leads within those organisations that may be able to then cross-fertilise and help us with what we're aiming to do around kind of really getting these kind of links across. So yes, we're at the start of it, but it feels quite an exciting bit of work for us in how we link with those organisations, how we use kind of key individuals, how we get all these voluntary organisations trained, how we get them into thinking around child protection. We're certainly reliant on Garvo's kind of networks and personnel in terms of helping us do some of that, but it's something that we've certainly been thinking about both locally and on more of a regional level. And we've started to think about how we can use our website, for example, in a smarter way around trying to offer some online more kind of level 1 orientated online information so that voluntary organisations can access level 1 in a much kind of, you know, stepping stone way, but also kind of linking where making sure that our key organisations are linked in and that we're using people who already exist in terms of their training, their knowledge and understanding around child protection, using them smartly.
I think it's the latter part which is the important thing for me, using their knowledge and their experience as well, which does help others.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Also, Simon Birch would like to have a word,
Got
please.
a brace of Simons here today, haven't you? Just to add very briefly to what Jane said, on page 37, Jane's captured the move that we've been making, particularly through the audit processes, which started where you would expect about looking at schools and has gradually moved further outwards. So as you look down that list, you'll see after-school clubs, specifically mentioned, and the fact that Gavo are screening 141 organisations so that we can prioritise how we work with them. So that journey, as Jane's described it, is spreading out from the statutory sector to incorporate those really important areas.
Councillor Blakeborough.
I think this sort of moves on from there, actually. Just the case studies that you've done, I like those. They help me because it puts it into practice. The changes that have been made and kind of what it looks like. And I'm just looking at point 2, which is the impact of multi-agency working, which we've been talking about. And I guess I'm looking more at the cross-directorate working within the organisation. And we are probably aware of an issue that was being raised over the last couple of weeks in terms of post-16 transport and young people with additional learning needs. So in terms of the case study, I'm just wondering if you were able to give any practical changes that have happened in response to this issue, particularly with the transitional period for young people with additional learning needs from secondary school into further education. Because I know there's been some changes, but I just would like to know a little bit more about the practical changes made.
I'm afraid I'm not the person to ask that question of.
I think, in fairness, Councillor Brave, that's taken us outside the safeguarding discussion, really. Although the issues are the same about how we work more effectively with our partners, I mean, that is moving forward. I know I've had conversations with Sarah in terms of education, and she's talking to transport, so I know that's moving forward. But I think it does take us outside the area that Jane can really comment on today. So perhaps we can talk separately about that.
Thank you, Simon. That was useful. Councillor Farley.
Thank you. We're working in a county context and a regional context. But if you, as I do, come from somewhere like Chepstow, you've also got to think about cross-border issues. I wonder if you could give us a bit of an idea about what linkages there are, or if they're not there, need to be, with neighbouring authority. For example, Gloucestershire. And we must remember that some of the children in our county go to school across the border and vice versa.
Certainly at an operational level, those links are very clearly in place. And I'm thinking of kind of case examples where we have professional allegations about children who go to school in Monmouthshire and a concern arises about something within their school. They live in Gloucestershire. They attend school in Monmouthshire. We're very clear in terms of our processes around who does what. Our statutory processes help us with that. Who's responsible for the initial investigation? Who's responsible for managing the professional aspect of that? And what those expectations are on the different roles within that are very clearly set out within our procedures.
And presumably there's, by the same token then, there's good communication and advance warning of emerging issues or concerns about in specific places and people.
Yes, I would hope that our operational processes would give us warning of those.
I'm pleased to hear that. I mean, I've asked that question on previous occasions, not of you, and that's a very clear answer, and thank you.
Councillor Guppy.
Yes, it's just a question regarding to the Eston inspection in regard to the safeguarding that was deemed unsatisfactory. And then with the monitoring visit again, that they said that there was some shortcomings. Where do you feel we're at now, and how soon do you think you're going to resolve those issues in view of the return of the Eston inspection?
Thank you. Yes, in the last inspection letter, I think there were some very positive comments made about the way in which the safeguarding unit was building up, and that's been repeated by Non today. The issues that we were really focusing on were those, again, the ones that Non talked about at the beginning of her presentation, about the overall leadership and governance and so forth. And really what we're experiencing today is a big shift towards reaching that level of competence around this, I believe, because what I hope we've provided today, and you'll be able to judge, is the sort of information that enables you to ask yourself that crucial question: are we doing all we can to safeguard children? And what we've tried to lay out today is that sort of strategic clarity and direction on the things that are really key to us at the moment. But the detail there, if you should wish to dig into it, so professional allegations, there's the figures there. I think this is a very important step today. That's why we've got a special meeting for it. And I'm confident that we are really shifting the direction that Eston, would want to see us moving in.
Has anybody else got any questions? No? Well, Jane, I'd like to thank you very much for that, because that was really detailed, and it's certainly much more detailed than the last report. So I feel we've caught up now, we've played catch up, and thank you very much for that. Okay. If you just say that, I can't see. Excuse me, slight lull whilst I get advice. You may have noticed that our next two speakers are not here, and apparently they've been caught up in traffic. So Hazel has now gone to see if she can see if they're outside or in the building. All right, so you can have a slight lull, but please remember there's live streaming at all times, so no gossip. Thank you.
Can we leave the chamber for 2 seconds, please?
Yes, of course. Councillor Farley has just said, and I think it's very apt, that we really ought to have a switch that goes off, perhaps during times when we have a recess, as they do in the House of Parliament. Not that I'm comparing the two, but... Did you see Hazel out? Right, thank you. Well, very kindly, Margaret Rooney from CSSIW has agreed to give a report on the fostering service. Now, for those of you who've read it in our agenda today, it is very short and brief account of a standard inspection, and the reason that it is so short is that it's a very positive overview. And that really is how we see it, I think. However, there will be questions afterwards. And Margaret, thank you very much for swapping your place and saving us a lot of trouble. Thank you.
Okay, it is quite a short report. If I could just explain some of the background to that. CSIW, this inspection is part of CSIW's regular annual regulatory inspections of fostering agencies. So the fostering service within Monmouthshire falls within that. So every year we inspect all fostering agencies. Now when we inspect, we do two types of inspections. One which is called a baseline inspection, and that would be an inspection that would cover all aspects of the service: quality of staffing, quality of leadership and management, quality of foster carers, and the full quality of life. And then that's once every 3 years. And then the intervening years, we undertake short focused inspections, of which this was a focus inspection. So that's sort of a little bit of background as to why it's a shorter report. When we're doing our fostering inspections, what we're looking at particularly is those sort of systems and processes that are in place for fostering services that will support good outcomes for children that are placed with foster carers. So we're looking at adherence to regulations, looking at training for foster carers, how they're assessed, how they're reviewed. We speak to young people, we speak to foster carers, we speak to staff. Obviously, when we're doing a baseline inspection, that would be a lot more protracted in depth, and then the focus inspections are more focused on particular areas. So this inspection was a focus inspection. It followed an inspection the previous year, which was a baseline inspection where there were some positives found and several areas for improvement. However, that inspection had found that there was a new manager in place who was doing some good work, had put some plans in place to bring the service on, and we had seen some improvements from the previous year, and I think this focus inspection saw some of those improvements still taking place and carrying on. So what we found were some positives, which were particularly around support for foster carers, in terms of training, and we also found improvements in terms of the voice of the young person being reflected in that training for foster carers. The inspector found that there was a big commitment from the local authority into developing and improving foster care skills. And I think that's probably linked to the payment for skills and allowance policy, which the local authorities introduced, where what the aim of that policy is to try to increase the skills of foster carers, but in particular also to focus on increasing skills for foster carers to look after children with perhaps some more complex needs. Now, I know in the Head of Adult Services report this year, perhaps the progress in that hasn't been as swiftly as the local authority would have wanted, but that policy is there, and they're hoping to take that. The local authority is hoping to take that forward to increase the skills of foster carers. As I said before, there was an improvement in, and there was positives around the support for foster carers, and the inspector found that the foster service had been relocated within the placement and support team, which was the same team that is responsible for contact arrangements for young people and families. And the inspector found that had improved sort of communication between social workers and had helped communication with foster carers, and that was a positive. So it helps to support placement stability. The manager was taking forward her plans. You know, she was the inspector found her to be quite proactive and wanting to take forward plans to improve the service, and she was continuing at that time to try to improve on assessments. There was also improvements in the timeliness of reviews of foster carers, and the inspector had found that there was an independent reviewing officer was doing those reviews, which was a positive. So it is, in general, quite a positive report. The other thing, and this might reflect in my colleague who hasn't arrived yet, in some of her work. Within this report, the inspector highlights that the local authority that was providing foster placements for children within Monmouthshire. Now, in the Head of Adult Service report the year before last, that was reported that 60% of looked after children are being maintained within the local authority. I had a look at some statistics myself this morning before I came just to see where that had gone this year. And the Stats Office has that figure at 70% of children being kept within the local authority in the year before, in March 2013, and as of March 2014, that was at 69%. And in relation to Wales, that sort of an average is sort of the same as the Wales average. That's quite a positive. I guess the thing would be about for children with more complex needs. I think that's probably some of the things that my colleague was reflecting within her report. The inspector found there was positives around education for young, for looked after children, and she spoke to actually 2 young children as part of this focus inspection. And more broadly than that, within this year's ACRF, we found that education outcomes, or particularly attendance for looked after children, is quite good, which also sort of marries up with what the fostering report was saying. Although there might be some things around personal education plans, the attendance rates for looked after children are quite good in primary and secondary education, probably almost as good as any other child you would expect, which is what you would expect for any child. Listening to the voice of young children, you'll also see is reflected in the report as something that had improved during for this particular fostering inspection. And we're aware that the Council has taken forward the development of the Children in Care Council and has supported with funding for a post to support that, which would be a person who's formally looked after, which is also a positive. I think it is quite a short report. It does reflect improvements, a sort of a journey. So from 3 years ago, where the report was probably a much more negative view, new manager coming in, taking forward the service, and it looks like those improvements are being taken forward. Now, as part of work that we may do in the local, we will be doing the local authority later on in the year in children's services. The plan is that we'll undertake the fostering inspection at the same time, and we will do a baseline inspection this year, simply because we're doing that children's inspection in children's services. So we'll do a baseline inspection this year at the same time as the children's services inspection. So I'm happy. I'm sorry it's a short presentation, but it's quite a short report. I'm happy to take any questions that members might have.
Thank you, Margaret. That was very helpful. And in fact, it was useful being short, and it was put to the end for that purpose, because we thought we were going to have longer ones, but we've changed it around. We have got a question. Councillor Farley, please.
Thank you. I'm going to go to page 3 of the report, page 79 of the bundle, depending on how you're following it. And the final point on that page, what needs to be done to improve the service. Now, I'm intrigued by this very gnomic. Is it service compliant and it's a misprint, or is it service complaint? And if it's service complaint, there's no reference anywhere else to complaints or complaints procedures. So if you're able to enlighten me, I'd be very grateful. Have you got the bit that I've spotted?
I do. I sat with the inspector yesterday and pointed this very thing out to her. Normally, to be honest, I would expect more to be written in this section. Because it was a short report, I'm guessing that's the reason why it should read. It's a typo. It should be services compliant with regulations.
The service is compliant. So it's a tick.
So apologies on behalf of CSIW.
I can sleep more easily at my microphone
you
now.
can.
Thank you.
Margaret, I'd like to ask a question, please. Just above that point is increase in young people's involvement in training of foster carers, which sounds a really good idea. How is this being brought about, please?
Well, I'm afraid I can't answer that particular question, because I didn't actually discuss that particular point with the inspector. But if you allow me to go back and ask, I will make sure you get that information. What you mean? Okay.
That would be very useful. Thank you.
Oh, perhaps Tracy.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay, Tracy.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to think what that would be relating to. I think we have a Skills to Foster course, which is the first introductory training before we assess prospective new foster carers, and we've started involving young people in that training course, and that's been quite a new development. So I think that's probably what that is referring to.
And would that expand to adoptees, adopters as well? Their course is prospective adopters. Oh, good. Okay, thank you. Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to ask two bits of it, really. Are there more long-term fostering for long periods? Is that more common than the ones that are only fostered for a little while because mother's in hospital and sort of things like that? Is there much difference between it?
It varies, because we'll meet the needs of that child.
Yes.
So clearly, where there's very short-term need, then that's the need we would meet. In terms of the looked after children population, most of the children are in care for a longer period of time. There are times that young people come into care for a very short period of time. It could be for a night or two, and that might be where we've got significant information that causes us concerns, and they come into care for a short period while we gather more information and make further decisions, and often those children might be able to return quite quickly. Equally, we have other children who come in for a longer period of time. We provide support to the family, and we're able to rehabilitate them home over a period of time. That often takes 2 or 3 months. Equally, there are other children who come into care and obviously never return to their parents' care. That some will return to wider family, and others move on to adoption or remain in care long term. So there's a whole range. But if you looked, we've broadly got around 100 children in care. The majority of those would be in for a longer period, really.
The other one I was going to ask. Do you find a difficulty in finding foster carers, not that are particularly willing, because obviously they're all willing to be foster carers, but are in a position when they can cope with taking in children with special needs and disabilities and things like that? Do you have...
Yes.
You do. As I was wondering whether that's because it isn't always that they don't want to have them. It is sometimes that they're not in a position to be able to cope with them.
Yeah, for children with more complex needs, and that might be a disability, or often it's their emotional needs and their behaviour as a result of that. Certainly, we do struggle to find foster carers who can manage those children. For some of our more children with more complex needs, they are in independent fostering placements or a small number in residential placements because of those needs. But what we're working hard to do, and I think the report comments on that, is really about looking at how we can support foster carers, both through training but through other support they need, through the intervention of our LAC psychologists that we have, to be able to manage those children more effectively. And I think that's about us being as responsive as we can to the individual needs of those foster carers and their wider families, because foster carers are part of their own family and there's a whole range of support they bring themselves. But that's certainly how we're trying to develop the service.
And I was very pleased to see that in the improvements that there's increased being able to keep them within their own communities, or at least within their own county, because you hear tales of years ago of where they were sent miles and miles away from their families, so there wasn't any possibility for them to visit, and that was very traumatic, and it's wonderful to see that you can keep them as near as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that all? Right, thank you, Margaret. That's oh yes, sorry.
Yeah, may I
Councillor
just ask a question on question 1? Because from this report, is there actions that we need to be looking at, reference to the comments made, areas for improvement? Question 1 is, elected members were committed to supporting better education outcomes but did not appear to have a good understanding of the level. Where did you get that from? Was that scrutinising or asking questions of just a few members, or and what is the action plan for that? Do we have an action plan in place now to make sure that we do have a better understanding?
I think you're referring to the looked after children inspection, which is the next. Now, I didn't lead on that particular. Okay, right. But I would imagine there probably is that it spoke to councillors. Yes.
I know it is confusing, and we are back to front. Thank you very much, Margaret. Now, I think that Simon, are you going to take this next report as Chief Officer and be supported by... Oh, no, you're not. I tell you what, whilst we give Pam a chance to get settled, I've got a question for Councillor Burrows, if possible, and it's about corporate parenting. Some concerns have been raised throughout that not enough members, in particular, and know enough about corporate parenting. Now, I know we've had a training day in the past, but of course, you know, our attendance levels aren't always very high. I wonder how you're embedding this into our system, into our culture, because it is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Corporate parenting, in my view, is as fundamental in terms of member responsibility as safeguarding is, because it's something that transcends pretty much everything we do as far as looked after children is concerned. Yes, we've had instances where we've tried to get some training organised, and there's been the occasional reports that come through council to give reminders to members and officers alike, because it is not only just members but officers of the authority as well that have the statutory responsibility for corporate parenting. What I'm very keen to do, now that we've actually got the corporate parenting panel set up, which has been going through this year and is making good progress in my view, there's a lot of work to do there, but certainly that is becoming a forum where information is starting to coalesce out about what's happening as far as Monmouthshire is concerned, and the corporate parenting story. One very exciting prospect there is that very shortly we will be actually having a Looked After Children's Council, where there will be actually a representative actually on that panel, which is going to be a very exciting opportunity, because for the very first time we will actually start to hear the voice of those service users that are so important. So for me, it's just so fundamental that that's in place as soon as possible. But to respond to your point, that corporating panel will be the focus of information gathering and actually dissemination beyond that. And what I envisage is that the 4 scrutiny chairs who are already on board with having a grouping that is actually going to be receiving information relating to safeguarding, and that will be starting very shortly, that will allow information to permeate out through all the select committees, across all the directorates and out into the public domain, because of course these are all public meetings, that matters relating to corporate parenting will finally be able to follow the same path. So as information is gathered by the corporate parenting panel group, it will then, the minutes of those meetings, and I happy to have direct dialogues with those group of chairs to share with them what I view as important information in those minutes, so that they then can selectively allow that information to move outwards. And certainly then we'll be starting getting feedback from members if they feel there are gaps in their training and information in terms of what's happening on the corporate parenting story. Then certainly we're going to actually have some functionality about this. So that's really what's happening at the moment, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Burrows. Right, I think, Pam, are you ready, do you think? Yes. Right, well, I'll just introduce you. Following an inspection by the Care and Social Services Inspectorate of Wales, Pam Clacton will be giving us a review, a report, and questions will be taken by her and Tracy, I think, afterwards. Is that right? Tracy Jeffs, Head of Children's Services. However, the actual introduction to this, as is today, everything today, it's back to front. The actual introduction by Simon is on page 69, as opposed to the beginning of the report on 61. So if you want to look at Simon's introduction, where he says it's to ensure effective scrutiny of the CSSIW inspection report into the safeguarding and planning of looked after children and care leavers who exhibit vulnerable or risky behaviours. So I'll now hand you over to Pam. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I first apologise for my lateness? I'm afraid I had a meeting in Ryde and got stuck behind a slow-moving vehicle. I'm sure we've all been there. But I'd also like to thank you for this opportunity to present this report to the committee. I think it's one of the aims of CSIW to be more proactive in presenting the outcomes of inspections to members in a timely way, and certainly, this is a very timely opportunity really to do this. I've got a presentation. Hopefully everyone has had time to look at the report. But first of all, if we just, the introduction is just going to be about, I thought it might be useful for you to have a little bit of the background of the inspection, the reason for it and the purpose for it, so that it could be put in context. I think this is one of the most important aspects of inspection, is that because it's always to be remembered that it's a snapshot of practice at that time. Bearing in mind what the inspection was looking at is very useful in considering the work of social services, and particularly in this instance children's services, and how it fits into the whole picture. So the background really was that I'm sure councillors will be aware that in England there have been several very concerning reviews about child sexual exploitation. The most recent one in Rotherham, very recent. But before that actually came to light, Welsh ministers were very exercised by the outcome of those reviews, and had quite a high level of concern really that looked after young people in Wales could be vulnerable and could be at risk. So they tasked us with going out and looking at that. It's like everything else, when you go out and have a look at the nation, because it's the first kind of national inspection since the safeguarding review in 2009, all of a sudden we found that, you know, we were also looking at care leavers and we were also looking at advocacy. So it did broaden it slightly, but I think it's really important to remember that we were looking at the most vulnerable. And the way that the inspection was planned was really all around that. And the methodology was that we really requested local authorities to send us a profile of their looked after population and care leavers, 11 plus, who met any one of 13 vulnerabilities. And these range from what, you know, might be considered something in these days to be quite common, you know, not in employment and education, which affects a lot of young people, not only those who are looked after, you know, to those believed to be at risk of from sexual exploitation, missing, had mental health, substance misuse. So the full range, really. And from those, for each local authority, we selected 10 cases, of which we looked in detail at 3. So another thing to bear in mind is this is a very small number. There are 6,000 approximately looked after children in Wales. We only asked for the cases where vulnerability had already been identified. So we were not looking at the general looked after population. And from that then, when the report on the national report comes out, probably next month now, hopefully you'll see a profile of that and see that actually, although quite, I suppose, higher than we expected number of young people were identified, the vulnerabilities they had, very few of them had more than, you know, 2, and one of them might be one that perhaps you wouldn't be so concerned about, but that was the profile that we looked for. The purpose, so those are the parameters really around the inspection. The purpose was to offer reassurance, I think, that looked after young people in Wales were not at risk, if we could do that, and that arrangements were secure, and also to perhaps inform some of the legislation that's, you know, about to become real in the new Act. And, you know, it's believed that there's quite a wide range of legislation for children already available. And do we need more? Or, you know, or do we need more specific guidance in certain areas? So this was a good opportunity to look at that as well. Okay, so I think that's probably enough about the background. But if anyone wants to know anything more about the methodology, you're very welcome to ask me. So the findings for Monmouth, and the way that these findings are laid out, in that we had what we call domains or areas, and these are quite specific really, and they're about corporate and leadership and management arrangements. They're about assessment, care management and practice. They're about safeguarding. They were about the voice of the child, and how, which included advocacy then in that particular area, and how local authorities were responding to the views of children and incorporating them into the work they did. So if we look in specifically at Monmouthshire, so there was a corporate parenting strategy we found that had been recently adopted, but arrangements were underdeveloped. And I think a question I heard being asked when I came in, what we found was that members were well informed. The members we saw, they did understand, you know, and were able to talk about some of the issues facing young people, especially those the most vulnerable, but weren't really able to point us in the direction of what difference their influence had made to the outcomes. And that is the key question, really, that we were asking people. Because what we found across Wales was that members are, you know, far better informed than they've ever been, I think, about performance, about the profile of looked after, although nobody actually, no local authority actually presented the profile of risk as we saw it, in terms of, do you know how many of your young people went missing last year? Do you know how many of them, moved? You should know how many moved 3 times, but do you know how many moved more than 3 times? And we found that, that was one of the things that concerned us, that, when it was more than 3 times, in some authorities that was very high, members didn't know about that. So it was the information was there, but in order to make decisions about future planning, which is absolutely crucial for these children, did people know enough, and did they, could they point us in the direction of what they had actually done as elected members to make a difference? And that's where it was much more difficult for people to answer us. And Monmouthshire wasn't alone there. And what was happening here was that work had been done, started in a number of areas, to look at corporate parenting, how that could be improved, to look at children's council, but at the time we were here, those things weren't in place, although plans had been drawn up. And similarly, in terms of work experience or opportunities for young people to gain economic independence. We found that one of the big issues for vulnerable young people was the quality of the care that they received. The quality of carers was absolutely crucial and made, probably the most significant difference to the outcome. And Monmouthshire, like a lot of local authorities, had a placement strategy, and actually I will say that yours was one of the better ones, in that it did actually point out what needed to be done. Because sometimes what happens with strategies is people point out what the best practice is, but not actually what their authority needs to do to achieve that best practice. And they had identified the key actions needed, and in fact the more difficult to place young people, the more vulnerable young people were identified in there. And in 2011, when this was done, there was a need then to increase the range of placements so that young people did not have to be placed out of county and did not have to be away from their communities and their families to receive the care they needed. And actually there was a good profile of the workforce in that strategy, it's just that it hadn't been updated. There have been, I'm sure you're aware, issues about workforce here, and we did find that had a negative impact on continuity of care planning and staff confidence. Staff were saying to us that they were at times lacked guidance. They didn't feel confident that they could follow the right process. And processes aren't everything, but they do ensure there's a framework around risk and vulnerability, which keeps not only children safe, but staff as well, so that staff know that they have actually followed the procedures in the right way, and that those decisions have been signed off and approved by the right people. And they were saying, some staff were saying here, they didn't feel that was happening. Some staff felt they hadn't had training at the right level. And this appeared to go back to restructuring, and where staff had moved around quite a lot. And similarly, cases had moved as well. So this was reflected in the young people we saw who said, oh, well, we all had different workers, which can happen as a natural progression anyway, but it would seem that, here it had definitely had a negative impact. Okay. Moving on to some positive points, we found that arrangements to support looked after young people in education were effective for the most part. Some of the cases we tracked, we thought that schools were trying very hard to support looked after young people, that teachers were actively involved in planning, which is a very positive thing. So the corporate message across education did seem to be, working, getting there. And care leavers were positive about the support they received. They liked their workers. This was national, actually. They felt that their personal advisors and workers gave them the support they needed when they needed it. They felt they were more responsive than social workers. They talked about their past careers in care, where they'd felt that they'd had a lot of change as a social worker, a lot of change to placement in some cases, and they were able to contrast that with the level of service they were getting at presently, which they thought was positive. Assessments. So the quality assessments was inconsistent. We probably said that in every report. It is very difficult to achieve consistency. However, one of the issues we were concerned about here in Monmouthshire was that risk assessments were underdeveloped. We did have a small case sample, admittedly, but what we didn't see positive work there. And again, workers expressed some concern, lack of confidence and competence in carrying out this work. We did see that in some areas, team managers had been appointed who gave a much more positive picture. They had identified these shortfalls and they were working towards them. And similarly with senior managers, they had also identified these shortfalls. And I think the development of the quality unit was one of the things which was put in place to move this forward. In terms of partnership working, there was a significant delay in accessing mental health services for young people. Again, this was a picture we found across Wales. The ability to influence partners to work together more effectively to support looked after children was something that councils everywhere seem to struggle with. Where services were being provided, they were quite often funded by social services rather than health. Again, this is a national issue. The effect of that, I think, is one of the most concerning factors, because those relatively small number of young people who do go on to be emotionally damaged long term, it is often because they don't get the right support at the right time. So by the time their behaviour is escalated to a point where people say, well, somebody's got to fund a service for this, actually it's quite a long way down the line for them. I've touched on this already. There had been a lack of consistent guidance for staff managing safeguarding. It seems that in an effort to reduce bureaucracy and paperwork, something that everyone would aim to do, that in some cases staff felt that it hadn't been replaced with anything substantial enough to give them the guidance they felt they needed. And so when they were going through the process, for instance, the child protection process, we struggled to find evidence that Section 47 investigations had taken place. Now, staff told us they had, but that was recorded within the file. There was no discrete document that people could look at and say, well, we know that's been done, and that was the outcome of it. And that is very significant, because when you're considering, if a child or young person has suffered significant harm, you do need to have an accurate record of that. And similarly, the assessment that follows from that decision and the plan will hinge on what was actually, found out in the initial investigation. And there was a lack of understanding for staff between care plan and risk management mechanisms. And by that, I mean that the plans we saw very rarely reflected the risks that we were coming across in the files. And although we did see some effective partnership work, the sharing of risk and the sharing of the management of risk, was definitely an area for development.
and more importantly, that staff understood what they needed to do when a risk had been identified. And again, certainly the arrangements for supervision and the recording of decision making, as I've mentioned, was inconsistent. So the next steps, I think within your pack you've seen the plan that senior officers have developed, an action plan to address the areas for improvement. And we are going to carry out a follow-up inspection to monitor the progress being made, and that will take place next month. So members are probably aware of that. If anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
I'll just come back. Thank you, Carl. That was very interesting. And I think it does raise some important questions. Right, Councillor Powell, did you have your hand up?
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Going on from the workforce, on, I can find the page for you, page 64, the third paragraph round, it said, the workforce had been restructured in April 2013 and workers reported that transition arrangements had a negative impact on their confidence and morale, which was still evident at the time of the inspection. What evidence is there now that things have changed and got better?
Well, we haven't actually come back to have a look at that.
No, but you've kept monitoring us all the way along through, haven't you? You know, this isn't just...
No, not really.
You haven't?
No.
Ah.
The way
I thought perhaps, you know, there'd been monitoring on the way.
No. The way it works is that, you know, although we found that some arrangements were not satisfactory when we were here, what we said to senior officers then was, well, this is what we've found, you know, over to you now, and we will give you a period of time to, because these things, especially when there's been restructuring, it's not a simple thing to put right. It takes a while for staff's confidence to be built back up, for arrangements to be, you know, robust and for people to fully understand them. So I think it'll be something like 6 months, perhaps a little bit longer, when we come back and have a look. And so because we were aware that, you know, after a restructuring, this is something that will happen. Because staff have got a new role, they've got new responsibilities. I'm sure members are aware about the national difficulties in recruiting experienced and qualified staff, and that affects every authority. So in order to, you know, build up that experience for staff and give them the opportunity to, for instance, shadow other workers, to gain that valuable experience that does take time. And so, you know, I suppose what we were saying then, look, we have found some things that have concerned us. However, we appreciate the position you're in at the moment and the stage you are in your restructuring. So we'll give you time to, you know, put some of those arrangements in place. And I've had a look at the plan, and you can see there that, you know, the recommendations, or the areas for improvements have been incorporated into that plan.
So hopefully you'll see the improvements when you come.
Hopefully,
next
yes,
time.
we will.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I thought perhaps you
No, that's quite understandable.
Monitoring in between.
That would only happen if we carried out, you know, when you do a national inspection, because it is very focused, you only sometimes pick up on these issues, and because we look at a very small number of cases, we think, well, you know, it's not entirely fair, you know, to make a judgment on that.
No.
So we'll come back and have a wider look.
Yeah.
And then, you know, hopefully we will be satisfied then that arrangements have improved and that, you know, we can have a degree of confidence. If we didn't, then that's when our monitoring programme would come in.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Councillor Farley, please.
Thank you. I'm grateful for what you've just said, although that wasn't what my question was going to be about, because I think one or two of us have sort of been taken a little bit aback at evidence now emerging that there were some of these underlying difficulties for people in the service, and it's good that they've come out. and it's good that they're being addressed, and we've heard how those are being addressed, so I'm grateful to you for that. My question's slightly different. I'm not even sure it's a question for you, actually, Pam, with all, but anyway, I'm interested on page 63 of our bundle, page 3 of your report. It's the final bullet point in the positives. I almost think Simon might be the person to answer. It talks about the South East Wales Safeguarding Children's Board and talks about the adoption of a focus on adolescents who exhibit harmful behaviours. How are those kind of focal points determined at any one time or in any one year? Why was that the one to go for and not something else? That's the first question.
Right. Yes, I mean, that was determined. I mean, the regional board is a very large board with representation from all of the parties you'd expect, including police, health, the 5 authorities, probation, education. I could sort of go on. And we had, and as we were developing into a new board 18 months ago, we spent a lot of time saying what would our 3-year strategy look like. And within that, we identified 4 key areas, and we also within that prioritised them on a sort of annual basis. So in year 1 our focus was very much around neglect. Year 2 is moving into this subject area, and in a sense, although it might seem a huge arena, I think reaching agreement on what the broad areas were wasn't that difficult, because they're such significant issues, and it's no coincidence that Pam and her colleagues should have wanted to come and ask that question, because as she started by saying, these are people for whom there are great risks and challenges and vulnerabilities, and Rotherham and a number of other all point you back to that. So, you know, we looked at the evidence we had, we looked at what the 5 local authorities were interested in, brought it all together, and quite easily a strategic plan came out which said that during 14-15 we were going to particularly focus on this area. But you'll already have picked up, I think, from when we were hearing particularly from Jane earlier, actually you can't really put boundaries around these. If you're talking about safeguarding or substance abuse or domestic abuse or children who go missing, you're very often, a lot of those roads lead back to the same place, and the people that we're most interested in keeping safe and helping to grow into confident adults.
Thank you. Can I have a couple more? Yes. I recognise and I'm pleased that you're the chair of the board, but some members here were also here this morning when we were looking at scrutiny of partnerships and single integrated plan. So inspired by that, I'm going to ask a question I wouldn't otherwise have necessarily raised today, but it is about the arrangements for scrutiny of the joint board, and if you could just sketch those out a little bit, please, Simon.
Yes, we don't have a separate scrutiny arrangement established around that board. It does go back through the relevant authorities. I suppose I suspect that one of the things you're particularly thinking of there is around health. Would I be correct in saying that, or?
You know my obsessions, don't you? It's just a general question, really. As we move more and more into partnership and joint working, I think it becomes a good question to keep asking. How do individual members carry out scrutiny? We're fine at the opportunities to welcome people such as Pam here and to talk with our own officers, but it's how we can access that bigger arena where all the different players are coming together and be reassured, really, that things are run there as well as we would like to think they were.
Right, I'll be brief with the 2 answers to that. In terms of all the partners around the table, then the G7 is the place at which Peter Fox and he's in the back there, Paul Matthews. So that's probably the correct answer. And I've been there twice as chair and given them presentations on the introduction of the safeguarding board and a sort of progress report. And I intend to go back on a 6-monthly basis. So that's very important. But I will then, perhaps it's my obsession rather than yours, I think the issue about health is important. And we are introducing a new structure which Jeff will be part of as the social services member, so to say. That's being finalised at the moment and links in with some of the expectations of the Welsh Government around how the new Act is going to work. I mention that because there's no question. I mean, Pam raised some important issues about health's response that we I'm very, very pleased to see in black and white. And I know that heads of service and directors are concerned about that. And in fact, it's the main topic for our next partnership meeting within that sort of joint arrangement I've just touched on, because it's, and again, it was a very strong theme from Rotherham, which is all right getting young people to be safe, but if you think you can just stop there when they've experienced such massive trauma, you're wrong. And a waiting list of 6 months for therapy or counselling when you've been sexually abused or whatever is clearly not acceptable. So we're going to be pushing very hard on that door and working with health to make sure we've got the psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, counsellors, everybody, you know, in place to provide that sort of support.
Thank you, Simon. My last question is slightly different. I don't know who this is for. Might be for Tracy, might be even for Jane, I don't know. In the report that we've just looked at, you do mention getting the views of people, young people, leaving looked after care. And I'm interested in really how those were derived, whether it was a case of, say, an inspector, presumably a pretty daunting presence maybe for some young people to go and talk to them, or whether there are other ways that we could consider of getting young people's views into play, because it is important, I think, that we not only give them the respect of listening to them, but that we find ways of enabling their voices to come through sort of untrammeled and unfiltered, if I could put it like that.
I think you've hit on a very important issue there. We're very conscious when we carry out these inspections that you know, we can only gain the views of those young people who are willing to come and speak to us. And as we were looking at the most vulnerable and quite honestly sometimes the most excluded, then we didn't get a high take-up of our individual interviews, because in the I worked out we should have had the opportunity to see 66 young people individually across Wales. And I think we probably met under half of those. So we asked local authorities to convene groups of looked after young people 11 plus and care leavers, and we spoke to them that way. So you know, we were sort of dependent on who attended those. I think they did, you know, care leavers are particularly vocal, because I think they feel they have kind of left the system in some ways, and you know and they've got some very good insight into what, you know, the progress that they've made, because they've gained a little maturity often. And I think that one of the most effective ways that I've seen it, and I think a couple of authorities have got a mentoring scheme whereby care leavers are trained to be mentors for looked after young people. But that is, it is a resource, you know, heavy. It's not something you can just do, because obviously you've got to have a lot of safeguards there, and they've got to be trained and supported and everything else. But actually, in terms of consultation, that's a much easier thing to do. So, you know, as part of a participation strategy, if you could recruit some care leavers to talk to young people themselves, I think you might find you'll get, you know, a very honest view of what's happening. And that's far, you know, less intrusive and easier to manage. We did carry out a survey across Wales, and we haven't reported that in the individual reports because we said they were anonymous and it would be in the national report. We got just under 200 responses, which I was quite pleased with, because the Children's Commissioner's Office had just carried out a survey. And I think the poor old looked after children thought, oh no, not again, you know. You know, and what is it in it for them? And I think that's an important question to ask yourself when, you know, you're asking them to do these things. You know, what is it in it for them? And if they are going to do a piece of work for you, then they should be, you know, valued, and that should be rewarded in the right way. Maybe not with money, but, you know, with something. So, but I think that, you know, members everywhere have been trying to, because I don't think you've got any children's homes, have you? So, because obviously when there's children's homes, members do the regulation visits, and they do have some contact then. But some authorities have set up participation groups, and after a while young people do gain confidence, and members will attend those on a sort of half-yearly basis to hear what the issues are, and that's managed because it needs to be. So, you know, young people will speak then about the experiences that they've had. So, your council, when you set it up, that should fulfil some of those roles. But people do need to think about what they, it's important that it's not just a token, and they do things like consult properly with people, But I think getting a representative view is a challenge, most definitely, for everybody. And certainly we've tried to set up some groups in the past, Margaret, haven't we, across Wales. And I wouldn't say that was entirely successful.
It's difficult, isn't it?
It is difficult.
Okay, thank you. Tracy?
Just to further respond to that, we've been working with a care leaver who some people here today have heard speak to Children's Services and various members of the authority, because I'm keen not to just have young people sat in front of people being expected to be spoken to and talked to and to give responses, because they've all had quite a difficult time. And Scott King works on a way of the young people write their experiences down in a book, and then that is videoed and it goes on to a DVD, so we wouldn't have to have young people stood in front of us to give their views. They'd be able to give their views in different ways. And Jill is currently working with Scott King to bring him back into the authority to do some work with our young people to develop different kind of media ways of engaging our young people and enabling them to tell their story for us in Monmouthshire, but also to widen that out and explain that, because anybody that was there for that discussion with Scott King understands where Scott is coming from. And we're also working to set up a group so that he can speak to foster carers, because he has a very clear view of what it has been like for him in care, and he is 25 now and had 38 placement moves, and he was abused in about 5 of those placements. So he has a real story to tell, and we were really lucky that we got him. And I know Jeff was here, saw that, and Simon Birch, and also the Chief Executive. And I think it's had a lasting impact because of the way that comes across, and because of that video. You don't have to have the young person there. It takes a long time to enable them to be able to talk about what's gone on for them. But with a bit more, we're working on some creative ideas really to enable them to tell their story without having to be stood here for us. So I just wanted to let everybody know that.
That's really positive, and at some stage perhaps he could come and talk to us. It would be very nice, because that would be really interesting. Sorry, Councillor Powell.
Thank you very much. I assume that after they grow up and they leave the foster carers and go out into the world, you keep in touch with them, obviously. Well, I hope you do. What sort of a record do you have of them getting into work and progressing their futures and lives, when probably they may have come from a family that had generations of non-workers? Do you find that happens at all, or is there no record of that?
There is a performance indicator that looks at young people who've been engaged in employment, education, at the age of 19. I do think it's a little bit unfair, I've got to say, when I worked on the other side of the fence, because, they might have been in a training scheme, kind of, in the 3 months leading up to the 19, and then, they finished. So it is, but it doesn't, nationally, that's not a wonderful picture, as you can imagine. Yeah. But, this morning I said, I'd been up in Mid Wales, and that was a meeting of the National Leaving Care Forum. And I would say that when that started, it was a much bleaker picture. So although we sometimes, sort of bemoan the fact that it's still not good, we come from a place where, very, very few looked after young people who went to university. Now, each local authority has a number of young people who do that. And they're actually, there's legislation to say they must be supported while they're there. And that, so that we mustn't forget sometimes the journey travelled. I think it's very easy to do that. In terms of work and work experience, that is a huge challenge, particularly in these economic times, clearly. But, local authorities are the biggest employers in most areas. So, I do think sometimes they can look more closely at their arrangements to see if they can, it doesn't have to be, a job in HR. It can be cutting grass at the side of the road. It can be, it it can be, you know, helping out in a school. There's so many opportunities, because actually, you are right, you know, the work ethic is not, you know, ingrained in some families. And so some young people live in a family where for generations, you know, they haven't experienced that. But once, you know, they get the message that, you know, work is rewarded, you generally find they respond very favourably. But they need a level of support to do that. Because, you know, most young people have the luxury of having a parent to wake them up in the morning if their alarm doesn't go off, give them breakfast and get them out the door. And, you know, in case a lot of people I know actually transport them to where they need to be. You know, and these young people don't have that. You know.
Can I just add to that? I think that question's a really good question. And I know that in Monmouthshire last year, there is a PI which looks at qualification points of formally looked after children. And this year, it's a slight dip in Monmouthshire, but the numbers are quite small, so that can happen. But on a broader point, that's the sort of information you're talking about there is the type of thing where the corporate parenting comes in, where the panel comes in, where that's the type of information that could be brought to the panel. I've seen panels in other areas where they look at the qualifications of looked after children, their attendance, and they really quiz officers about that, and their expectation is, you know, they're asking, well, why isn't this as good as any other child? Obviously, these children have gone through lots of difficulties, but that type of information is the type of information that I would expect in a corporate parenting panel, and for that to be disseminated out so that members know what has happened to our looked after children. Are they in education, training, employment? Have they got accommodation when they're 19? Those type of questions. So that's something to think about for the corporate as the panel develops further. I know it's sort of in early stages.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask a question now. On page 65, the last bullet point, it says the range of in-house placements available was not sufficient to provide for young people with challenging behaviour and additional needs. And I just wondered if this is being addressed and how and why. And I don't know who's going to answer this question, but it was brought up by, obviously, the Leeds Inspector. So I would like to know what's being done, please.
Okay. I think, you know, as we talked earlier in relation to the fostering inspection, we do struggle to recruit carers who have both the skill and the willingness to care for some very difficult and quite damaged young people. And, you know, that is a national issue. So a lot of our children with the more complex needs, and that relates to a lot of our teenagers, are in independent fostering placements and a small number in residential placements. So there's a number of approaches to that. I mean, one is around having some more targeted recruitment for older teenagers. And I think over the last few years, we had a general shortage of foster carers, being honest, and I think we've made good progress in terms of increasing the numbers of our foster carers, but for the most part that growth has been in for the younger age group. So we're now usually able to meet the needs of younger children coming into care. Where we still have a gap is around older children and those with more complex needs, so children with disabilities or more complex behaviour. So in terms of, so we're looking at how we can target our recruitment for older teenagers and focus our energies on that. And then the other aspect is around how we support those foster carers when we do identify those who are able and willing to care for those children. And that's again, in terms of some of the things we talked about earlier, so having a good training programme, having specific training programmes around specific behaviours, the use of our lax psychologist and how we can develop our therapeutic support project. We've got our play therapist who's working with some of our more complex children as well. So it's about developing those kind of programmes and support programmes around those children and the placements, and we try and link that up with education, with the carers, with the social workers, so there's a network of support. But it is difficult. It's difficult to find those people who are willing to take on those children, because it is a real challenge.
Yeah, I understand that, especially, you know, I'm on the adoption panel, as I keep saying, but it kind of runs parallel to that. I wondered if there was any financial incentive to take older children with problems. Obviously, we don't want people just to take them because of the money, but really it isn't a case of that, is it? I mean, it's far too serious an implication on their lives. So are the financial resources any different to those of younger children?
Within Monmouthshire, not currently. We pay, there's an age-related allowance, which differs for the age group. So older teenagers do get, it's a higher amount because of their needs. In relation, we then got the payment for skills allowance. So those carers who invest more in training and show their development will get a higher amount of remuneration. Some local authorities do pay just an additional fee for children who are aged 11 plus, and there are a number of authorities that do that. There's some work going on regionally to look at whether we adopt the same allowances, so harmonise fostering allowances across the region. And there's some scoping work going on to look at that, and part of the proposals there would be about paying an additional fee for children who are aged 11 and over. What we do on occasions, depending on the needs of the child, if we identify that a child specifically needs a single placement, which might be the case for certainly children who pose a risk to other children, and potentially where that's identified that because of their behaviour and their needs at that time, that's the right thing, then we would, if that carer was approved for 2 or 3 placements, we would pay them an additional fee in recognition that they're not taking another child. So we would make sure they didn't lose out for that reason. But there's a number of things that we're kind of looking at.
Has anybody else got a question, or shall we start to sum up? Oh yes,
one more, if I may.
Councillor Foley, and then I'll ask one. Yes.
Sorry, you using the word programme reminded me. I'd also wanted to ask about on page 67 of the bundle, 7 of the report. Take you to the paragraph at the end of question 3 there. The authority had a plan in place aimed at improving workers' agility, which sounds awfully like a sort of outdoor Chinese exercise program, doesn't it? But I know what it means. Decreasing bureaucracy and improving the electronic document system. Anyway, basically, the implication is things needed doing, and I don't know whether they have been done. But I'm minded to ask this question because only the other day, in a combined meeting of adults, select and strong communities, we came across a problem where an area of work was being slowed up by an inability to get, I guess, some software sorted out or whatever. And I just wondered if that was the same issue here. Is this a question of software support to give you a workable system, or is it something else? But either way, it doesn't sound terribly helpful.
The IT system is under development across adult and children's services at the moment, and that continues to be progressed, really. We're designing a bespoke system from the practitioner's perspective to make it easier for staff to use. There's a working group that are developing that across the service, and I think we're looking at April 2015 for that to be in place, and that is progressing. It's not something that can be dealt with quickly, and it leaves us in the position that we're having to make do with what we already have in place, which is recognised and was recognised in the inspection, wasn't fit for purpose in a lot of ways. So it is in hand, Councillor, yes.
Thank you, Tracy. I understand these things can't just be bought off the shelf in PC World, but it might have been something where if you wanted it, if it would be helpful, the committee should say, it could have said it was disappointed at the progress, but it sounds as though there's a timetable and programme of work which is going ahead and that you don't have any undue concerns. Am I right about that?
Not at this stage. I don't have any undue concerns, no.
But it's something to come back on, because this has happened, as I've said, in at least one other area where committees considered something, we've looked forward to something being done, and it hasn't been done. And, a comment from us might have helped, for example, the Cabinet member to get things moving more quickly. But for the moment, we just watch and wait. Thank you.
Right. Pam, I was just going to ask you, kind of to sum it up, but how do we compare with other authorities? Not just generally, but also, for example, mental health. We have a lack of staffing and facilities. Are we improving, or are we very poor in relation to others? Can you give me some idea, please?
It's a very difficult question because of the different arrangements across Wales. In terms of access to mental health services, that is a national issue. Undoubtedly, the threshold for the CAMS, the Service for Adolescents, is extremely high. Clearly, most of the young people we looked at did not meet that threshold. However, they suffered extreme emotional distress. I mean, we came across young people, not here, but in other authorities, who had made very serious attempts on their lives. I mean, really serious. And they'd be assessed and said, well, no, you don't meet our criteria. So, so it seems that what is needed is a primary mental health service. One that is flexible, is not necessarily on the medical model where someone's discharged, they don't turn up for an appointment, because these young people are not likely to be biddable in that way. So nationally, that is an issue, and a lot of the things that we've talked about today are, we haven't compared across, and the national report won't do that either. It will look at national arrangements. I think where perhaps the workforce issues, again, we saw those reflect in some areas, particularly where restructuring had taken place relatively recently. I think our concern in Monmouthshire was really around the safeguarding arrangements. And when we can't pick out, it makes us very twitchy when we can't look at what's been done and make a decision about it. And we couldn't do that here. And we couldn't do it here because the system of recording it had changed, staff had changed, team managers had changed, and so we couldn't pull through there, a solid sort of, as much as it can be, reassurance that everybody knew what to do when. And in fact, as I said in my presentation, staff told us they were floundering really in some, and that's where our concern would lie really. And we particularly say, the arrangements is a word we use because we do not set out to look at individual workers' performance. That would not be something we could achieve. The number of social workers that are in Wales. So what we need to do is satisfy ourselves that the arrangements in place to recruit, train, support, supervise staff are adequate, and more than adequate, that they worked effectively. And we did have some concerns here about that area of work. It's as I say, it's difficult to compare. I don't think it's particularly helpful, but certainly when we come back to have a look, we'll have a much fuller picture, because it could be that we just pick cases where things had happened and had not worked well. Hence, saying, well, and obviously we cross-reference that, so speaking to staff and speaking to partners, and I think I might have missed that in the presentation, but certainly the police had some concerns about the competency of staff in managing risk. Now, Simon has been very responsive to our concerns. I've got to say, I can't say anything else. He has been. But that was the one area where Simon did, feel that was not a fair representation, if I can say that, Simon. No, because you hadn't picked that up at your senior talks, had you? Your senior discussion and partnership working. And sometimes that is what happens with, like any organisation, you've got your strategic level where things maybe work, partners are sitting down, they're very civilised, and yes, all that's working. But when you talk to operational people, then they've got a different view. And I think that was the view we probably got. I think, these things, that's why these things do need to be interrogated at every level. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pam, and thank you for going to all that trouble to get here from Mid Wales today. It was very much appreciated. And hopefully, when you return, you will notice, I think you missed Jane's report anyway, but you will notice, ongoing and much better progress in all aspects, hopefully, but particularly related to safeguarding. I just want to ask Councillor Burrows, do you have any last words you want to say, or are you quite happy to leave it there?
No, I think Sorry, Chair. No, thank you, Chair. It's been quite an interesting afternoon. We've got through quite a bit. I think there's an awful lot of work still to be done, but I think there's some very positive directions that we're taking, and we welcome the inspection that comes in November to show the degree of progress that's been made in the intervening time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Is everybody finished? Well, I'd like to just say that in conclusion, I'm not going to go over everything because obviously we started off by saying that safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. And I think that is something that we've got to adhere to and to understand. And corporate parenting must be embedded, and we must all have a greater understanding of that. But I look forward to the inspection. In a way, of course, but I look forward to the inspection in November 14th. Yeah, as much as anyone does. But it concentrates the mind, and I look forward to the scrutiny afterwards and the post-review. So thank you all for coming and for your part today. Okay, the meeting is now closed, and it's only just over 2 hours. Please note. Thank you. Bye.